This is a hat trick
podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Hi, Armand.
Hello, Jimmy.
What's on the menu today, then?
So, we're going to talk about Homer,
Okay.
the greatest, the earliest, the beginning of ancient literature. And of course, unfortunately, when you say Homer today, people say, what, Homer Simpson? And the answer is no. We're talking about Homer, the author of, or composer of, the great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Okay, so people might recognise the Odyssey and Odysseus, but tell us about the Iliad.
Homer's Iliad is a long epic poem, 16,000 verses, that has come down to us in 24 books. It focuses on a war between the Greeks and the Trojans, a war which began because the Trojan prince Paris stole the beautiful Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the Greek hero, and Menelaus' brother Agamemnon, commander of the Greeks, is tasked with getting her back. Agamemnon needs to rely on his best soldier, Achilles, who everyone knows about, but Achilles is furious because Agamemnon has stolen Achilles' booty.
Hang on, you just use the word booty. You need to explain, I think, for our maybe younger listeners, because when they hear booty, they think of something completely different. Dodgy area these days, but, you know.
So when ancient Greek armies conquered other territories, they would take people as slaves.
Yes.
They would take objects of great value from those places, and that's what was called their booty, of course. That's really what I mean by it.
So a booty call in those days was about
Going to war and getting back valuable stuff, which included slaves.
Yeah.
So it's a story about anger. And Homer has done something quite brilliant there. He hasn't told us the whole story of the Trojan War from the very beginning, but he doesn't. He starts with this episode when Achilles and Agamemnon have a fight. And in fact, the very first word of the Iliad is anger. And he gives us this episode. In the course of it, he looks back at all the reasons why the war began, and he looks forward to what's going to happen, because we know at the end of the Iliad, Achilles will die.
So, you know, as a person who works in TV and you look at the way dramas are set up, it's a very modern way of telling a story, Homer. It begins with something very dramatic.
Yeah.
We do that in drama. You begin with a very dramatic scene, and then you tell backstory through flashback. So Homer invented the flashback.
He certainly did invent the flashback, and quite specifically invented the flashback because in the Odyssey, Odysseus has his various adventures on the way back from Troy. That's the story of his homecoming. And in the course of it, he ends up in an island called Scheria, and he tells his hosts what has happened to him, his adventures. So famously, the adventure with the Cyclops, for example, where he calls himself No One, and the Cyclops is blinded and shouting, "No one blinded me, no one blinded me." They all think he's gone mad. So
That's quite a good joke.
well, it's a good story, isn't it? And, you know, Homer loves that kind of joke, actually, and there are lots of puns in there. So in Greek, the word for no one, they say that no one blinded me is mertis, which is no one. But actually, if you put those two words together, mertis, it means wisdom, and it's the term that is used of Odysseus. He's a man of many wiles.
Wily Odysseus.
Yeah. So there's also a pun even when he's talking about no one blinded me. Anyway, but that's a flashback. It takes 3 books in the Odyssey. It is something that's imitated by Virgil much later in his Aeneid, where in order to tell the story of Troy, Aeneas, who has fled from Troy, ends up in Carthage and gives his backstory in 2 books of the Aeneid. So, that's one device. There are many others, I'm sure, that modern filmmakers would have picked up on.
But it's interesting that we do keep trying to remake these stories. I mean, that's the thing, is that this is being made by Sony in America, and it came out of a conversation I had with a senior executive over there. We were at a party, and he said, where do you go to college? I said, I went to Cambridge. He said, what do you do there? I said, I read classics. He went, he said, have you ever heard of the Trojan War? And I said, let me think. Yeah, I think I've heard of the Trojan War. This quote that you've picked out, this happens in battle. It's a kind of
middle of the battle scene.
Yeah.
So this is from Book 6 of the Iliad. The Greeks are failing because Achilles isn't there as the greatest of the warriors. And in the middle of the book, we go back to the battlefield where we have one Trojan warrior called Glaucus and a great Greek warrior, Diomedes, and they meet, and Diomedes asks his impressive-looking opponent, "Who are you?" And he says it in a rather boastful way. He says, "Anyone who comes up against my sword can expect his parents to weep." And Glaucus says, "Why do you ask me about my lineage?" And he then utters these lovely lines in Greek. "Just like the life of leaves is that of men. Some the wind blows down to earth, but then in spring the forest blooms and new leaves grow. So too men's generations come and go." So the idea that life is transient and the lives of men are like leaves, they come and go. But in the context of this story, it's got a lot of wonderful elements to it. One is, of course, that there's a sense in the Iliad that the heroes are actually very important and that their story survives because Homer is singing it. Mm-hmm. So it's all very well to say, we're like leaves on a tree, we just drop and other ones come up in our place. But actually, these individuals are heroes. They are people that the Greeks would have known about, and they are very important individuals in the story. But even more than that, it's the whole myth that this opens up, because what happens is he then says, "If you want to know what my lineage is, I'll tell you." And he gives him the story of his grandfather, Bellerophon. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful story in its own right. And so there's a lot of embedded myths here, and this story is embedded because Glaucus is telling it. He says, Bellerophon was sent into exile to Lycia. The reasons were that he was a beautiful young man, and the king of Argos, Proitus, had a wife who fancied him.
Fair enough.
And it's called the Potiphar's wife story, of course, where she then, being rejected by him because he's a decent young man, goes to the king and says he tried it on.
Right.
So the king doesn't want to kill him, but he sends him off to a relative. And there's this wonderful line in the Iliad where it's the only mention of something that looks like writing. So this is a pre-written text of the Iliad. It was orally composed and produced, and we have no reference to written objects except for this time where they say he was sent off with folded tablets on which were scratched baneful signs. And the tablets, it's like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they inform the king, "You've got to kill this man." Oh. So he sends him off to Lycia, and he tells the king, who we know of as King Iobates, that Bellerophon should be killed.
And Bellerophon doesn't know what's written.
No, he doesn't. He takes this
Again,
message.
That's a great plot, isn't it?
It's a fantastic plot.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the plot of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, of course. And the king doesn't want to kill him either. So what he does, he sets him challenges. He's got to kill the Chimera, which is this beast, which is a bit of lion and a bit of goat and a bit of snake. He's got to capture the winged horse Pegasus. Yeah. Anyway, Bellerophon goes off and does all these things. Eventually, Bellerophon, in fact, comes a cropper because he's so proud of his ability that he uses the winged horse Pegasus to try and go up to heaven. And the gods strike him down. And Glaucus says he had 3 children, one of whom was my father Hippolochus, and that's who I am. So he gives his lineage, but he does so by telling us this wonderful story of his grandfather Bellerophon. And then there's even a better twist to this, because Diomedes says, "Oh, you're his grandson. Well, my grandfather, Oeneus, welcomed yours in his home, and they exchanged gifts." So there was a Greek-Lycian interchange, and we are guest friends of old. And in the epic, being a guest friend, having entertained some foreign guests in your home, means that you have a particular obligation to them.
I mean, hospitality was
very key.
Almost a religious
It is religious. So the chief of the gods, Zeus, was known as Zeus Xenios, the Zeus of hospitality.
Yeah.
So you would
Because we get the word xenophobic from.
Indeed.
See?
There you go.
These words are just pouring out of us now.
So you don't want to be xenophobic, you want to be xenophilic if you don't want to violate Zeus's responsibilities.
So these two blokes are about to kill each other, end up not killing each other.
No, so at that point, Diomedes says, so we were guest friends of old, and he plants a spear in the ground, and he says, let's not kill each other, there are lots of other Greeks and Trojans to kill. And they shake hands, And then there's this wonderful moment where they exchange armour, because this is what you do if you're a hero on the battlefield. So Diomedes' armour is bronze, Glaucus's armour is gold. And so when they exchange armour, Glaucus exchanges his gold helmet and cuirass and all the rest of it for bronze armour. And Homer, unusually, the author, the composer of this Iliad, makes an authorial interjection. And he says he must have lost his wits because his armour was worth 10 times that of Diomedes. In fact, he says Diomedes' armour was worth 9 oxen.
But it gets quite funny, isn't it?
And Glaucus was worth 100 oxen.
Yeah.
And they exchanged it. And one wonders whether it's sort of a slightly nationalistic comment. We Greeks are jolly good at business. So Diomedes managed to get gold armour in exchange for his bronze, which was, worth 10 times less.
Yeah, but it's quite a funny way to end the story, isn't it?
It's humorous.
Yeah. It's also quite moving, isn't it?
Yeah.
It reminded me, I don't know why it reminded me, my grandfather was in the First World War. My father said he didn't talk much about it, but he said he quite liked the Germans. He said that some of the Germans that were captured, he liked them. To be honest, I think he had more problems with the French. As English people, because they're our closest neighbours, I guess. But he said,
there are those stories of, at Christmas, they used to play football.
At Christmas, the football is so moving. Yeah. And I mean, that brilliant film, All Quiet on the Western Front, which won the Oscar, is incredibly moving because they're just young men and they meet each other and they see beyond the uniform.
And they speak essentially the same language.
Yeah.
Which is another interesting point about the Iliad. So these are people speaking to each other in Greek, as far as we can tell. There doesn't seem to be any problems between intelligibility between what Glaucus and Diomedes say to each other. We don't know the historical background, but there does seem to have been some relationship between this city in Asia Minor that we call Troy or Ilium and the Greek mainland.
So when I was younger, I always found Homeric Greek was different from classical Greek, so it was a bit of a stretch for me sometimes. But the stories were great. I was fired up by the stories. But I remember we had a discussion where we were saying, well, could one bloke have written all this? And that whole debate about Shakespeare. Is there a debate raging around the Homer thing about whether it was a bunch of different poets and just one bloke sat down one day and wrote it all down, or did it come out of his head? Or who?
Yeah, so
was there a Homer?
Well, I think a lot of us who study this think there certainly was a Homer. The ancient sources are unanimous that Homer was a man, that he was what they call a divine bard. He would have produced his work orally, but this is a very highly polished oral poem. In fact, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two great works attributed to the bard Homer, are highly finished and quite individual. So that, for example, in style, they use a lot of similes. So over 200 similes in the course of the 16,000 lines of the Iliad. It's as if Homer can't sing without wanting to compare something that happens, say, on the battlefield to something in one's everyday experience. Mm-hmm. And so he says, just like a flock of birds on the field or whatever. And so you get these wonderful Homeric similes, which seem to be the sort of mark of Homer's own poetic expression. And the little bits of epic poetry that we have that survive that are not attributed to Homer don't do that. So there is something individualistic about these poems. The idea that they were created by a conglomerate, I think, is now generally not believed. They were created orally, so in the sense that the epic singer would learn to sing, to stick together formulas. Those formulas were wonderfully dissected and brought to life by two scholars, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who decided they would go and find, in the 30s, some examples of oral poetry. So they went to what was then Yugoslavia, and they listened to the bards there coming up with, these were illiterate bards, coming up with long stories, some as long as 8,000 lines of poetry, purely from their minds. They didn't have any written props. And it was a wonderful demonstration of what oral poetry is, and in order to produce that kind of poetry in rhythm, which is what we have in Homer, you have to have certain formulas, rhythmical formulas, in your mind, and you have to be trained to slot them in at the right place. And so the text of Homer is heavily formulaic in that way. You occasionally get repeated lines, such as when the rosy-fingered dawn appeared,
Yeah, and do you think that's when they were telling their stories? It was a way of remembering the next bit of narrative. It was they were marking time, saying rosy-fingered dawn left the couch of Tithonus, and then Apollo pulled his chariot across, and the next bit is this.
I think that's right. I mean, we have to assume that a lot of these were props for oral poets to be able to continue to tell the narrative.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when one reads Homer, one doesn't get a sense that there's a lot of repetition in that way. There are a few passages that are repeated verbatim. A scene of arming might come up more than once. This is putting on your helmet and your cuirass and so on, because that happens in battle. So why not repeat it? And you can imagine that perhaps an oral poet breathes a sigh of relief and thinks, okay, I'll be thinking about the next bit of the battle while I'm doing the arming scene.
Yeah.
But it is such a highly finished work that despite its orality, it's hard to imagine that this hasn't been polished up. A lot of it still has evidence of its oral provenance, but so much of the story is beautifully constructed that you had to have a genius at work, really. I mean, we have 24 books, or what became 24 books of the Iliad, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is so highly formed, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that it's hard to imagine it was simply rolled out of the mind of the singer.
So it wasn't improvised. It
was semi-improvised. But, if someone's been doing this for 30 years, say, and then this is their great work.
And they were invited to great banquets and religious festivals. They were like big stand-ups, weren't they?
They were. And they well, you'll know about that. They will
They'd be playing the O2 now if they were.
They'll be playing the O2, but there they are with their lyre singing thousands of lines of story and telling these brilliant stories. And Homer was known to be the greatest of them all. He was called the Divine Bard.
Yeah. He was like a kind of Taylor Swift of his day.
You could say that. There are all sorts of questions about how the text comes to be what it is today. I mean, I have my own theory, others have theirs. I suspect that the original text of Homer's Iliad was shorter, for example. I mean, the 16,000 lines that we have probably are not what Homer sang. He certainly couldn't have sung it in one sitting. He might have done so over several sittings, say at banquets.
Yeah.
But I think it was probably originally a shorter epic. You can boil it down to perhaps 6 books, and it could have been sung maybe over a few hours. Right. Whereas the current text has to be sung over several days. I think that was probably a developed form. I mean, the form that we have of Homer's Iliad in Greek really only comes down to us from the 3rd century BC. That is 400 years after Homer himself would have been creating his own epic. And it has been worked on, it has been added to, and it has various scholars who have pulled together what they say was Homer's Iliad. I think there are lots of bits of the Iliad which we can do well without. There are lots of stories of fighting which go on somewhat at length. We don't really need them.
I used to skip through those.
Yeah, one tends to a bit. I mean, a lot of them are beautifully done. There are wonderful little vignettes of heroes who appear and are killed, and then you hear about how, their young wife is mourning for them in some distant part of Greece. So, I mean, it's not like they're poor poetry. Surprisingly, all of it is pretty good poetry, but some of it is more telling than other bits.
But the quote itself is deeply philosophical, isn't it? It has a kind of melancholic feel to it, that we are, it's that thing of life is short, life is ephemeral. I mean, we touched upon it with Carpe Diem a bit, that you need to grab the day. And like you said, there's irony, because these people, ironically, they still live on because Homer wrote about them.
Yes.
So they have an eternity, they have a legacy. But as people, certainly as they get older, worry about their legacy, don't they? About what remains after my leaf has been scattered across the plains, what remains of me.
And the heroes of Homer are well aware that their duty is to fight in a noble and valorous way so that bards like Homer will sing about them. Because for them, immortality is being sung about. So if you want to become immortalized, you have to be sung about. You have to be spoken about. So the word for glory in Greek is kleos, and it's related to a word meaning to hear. So you hear people's activities, their prowess, and that makes them survive, makes them immortal. And they're right. I mean, Homer's songs lasted till today, are still translated. We still talk about Glaucus and Diomedes. And I think that's part of the wonderful irony of this passage, that on the one hand, our individual lives are meaningless, matter as little as leaves on a tree, but on the other hand, these particular leaves have been picked out and continue to resonate for listeners.
I came across this weird statistic, which speaks to this quote about the kind of, we're here today and gone tomorrow, and we're replaced by a whole new generation, and then we go. And as you pointed out, the irony is that we're still talking about these people. They haven't gone. They still fire our imaginations. They still live within us.
Yes.
And there was a statistic. There's a TikTok phenomenon now. A Swedish influencer, a female influencer, went round and asked the men in their life, how often do they think of the Roman Empire? And it's astonishing. Apparently, on average, men think of the Roman Empire at least 3 times a fortnight.
I don't get it. Do you? Well, I mean, classicists, yes, but men?
Yes. And honestly, my son, I had lunch with him yesterday, he's 25, and he lives in Brixton with his mates, none of them classicists. And one of their girlfriends brought it up. And she went round, and she said to Zach, who's a singer in a band, she said, when did you last think of the Roman Empire? I said, this morning. Well, that was great, Armand. That's my free supervision with a professor for this week. And I'll go off and think about other things. Probably the Roman Empire a lot, I would think. It was great, thank you.
Thank you.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Mulville. The producer is Diggory Waite, and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible, alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject. They hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.